Welcome, everyone. We had a little surprise on Friday. Rachel's children have pink eyes, so she couldn't come. And since I always say yes when Becky asks for a hand, I'm going to be presiding over this gathering today. And I love this word Becky thought for when this happens. It's an unpasteurized service. I need my script. Some things will be a little different and some things will be very familiar, and I might ask for help if I'm not quite sure about the next step. But let's start with announcements. Are there any announcements? Yes.
The Sharon Food Shelf asked the Mission Committee for soup. So Chrissy right away ordered us 5 cases of soup. It's there. But the food shelves are really being used, especially now with cold weather coming. So we also took over 28 pounds of food from the back, and we appreciate non-perishable food such as cereal, soup. Hearty soup is what people really need. Cameron had someone tell her last week, and I have too, that 1 can of that Progresso soup is a dinner for 2 for an older couple. So it's really appreciated. Also hygiene supplies, baby diapers, things like that, toothpaste, anything like that, pasta. Can you think of other things that go fly on off the shelf? Cake mixes, things like that. Snacks. People love snacks like granola bars. So anything, we can fill that basket again and take it right over the hill. People are very grateful, and so are we. Thank you.
No other announcements. So settle yourself. It's a really, really busy time for lots of people. Just come into the quietness of this morning. Stillness. Let us pray for peace and the things that make for peace as we light the peace candle.
In him was life, and the light was the light of the world.
The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness does not overcome it. It's a very short wick, but you can believe me that it's lit. Sometimes peace is very quiet. As a call to worship, I'm going to read a short poem from Lao Tzu. Empty your mind of all thoughts. Let your heart be at peace. Watch the turmoil of beings, but contemplate their return. Each separate being in the universe returns to the common source. Returning to the source is serenity. If you don't realize the source, you stumble in confusion and sorrow. When you realize where you come from, you naturally become tolerant, disinterested, amused, kind-hearted as a grandmother, dignified as a king. Immersed in the wonder of the way, you can deal with whatever life brings you. And when death comes, you are ready.
The responsive reading is Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want.
He makes me lie down in green pastures.
He leads me beside still waters.
He restores my soul and leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake.
Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death,
I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me.
you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies.
You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows.
Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life.
And I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. On Jordan's stormy banks I stand and cast a wishful eye to Canaan's fair and valley land where my possessions lie. I am bound for the promised land. I'm bound for the promised land. Oh, who will come and go with me? I'm bound for the promised land. O'er all those wide extended plains from eternal day, there the sun forever reigns and scatters night away. I'm bound for the promised land. I'm bound for the promised land. Oh, who will come and go with me? I'm bound for the promised land. No chilling winds or poisonous breath can reach that healthful shore. Sickness and sorrow, pain and death, nor guilt and fear no more. I am bound for the promised land. I'm bound for the promised land. Oh, who will come and go with me? I am bound for the promised land. When I shall reach that happy place and be forever blessed, for I shall see my Father's face and in his bosom rest. I am bound for the promised land. I'm bound for the promised land. Oh, who will come and go with me? I am bound for the promised land.
I meant to mention that I'm choosing not to wear a mask. I'm hoping that's okay with everyone. I'm triple boosted, but I want to make sure I'm audible. So for our children's time, let yourself slide back into that sensibility. I'm going to read an Emily Dickinson poem and then talk really briefly about it. The brain is wider than the sky, for put them side by side, the one the other will contain, with ease, and you beside. The brain is deeper than the sea, for hold them, blue to blue, the one the other will absorb, as sponges, buckets do. The brain is just the weight of God, for heft them, pound for pound, and they will differ, if they do, as syllable from sound. So Emily Dickinson was this amazing person who lived a very quiet life and a mental life that was as big as the cosmos. And in her time, there were only a few readers who ever saw her poems. She had one correspondent who was the editor of the Atlantic Monthly, and she sent him poems. And some of her her sister-in-law and her sister sometimes saw the poems. But she wasn't writing for celebrity or a career or any other reason. And she had a mind that used the cadences of hymns. She had a religious background, although over time, she became a pretty dedicated doubter, but she never abandoned the sense that the world of the spirit and the world of the universe was important. I'll just leave it at that for the moment. And the other thing that she was able to do is she had a kind of riddling mind. So she loved playing with words. She had an enormous vocabulary. And this one plays with this notion of the brain. And the reason I thought of it as a possible occasion for children's time is I think a lot of children would find this funny. And it's meant to be funny, that the brain is wider than the sky. And this brain can contain the sky. So we know that to be true, but we don't think about it very often. And I find when I'm spending time with small children, they do think about those kind of equations and those possibilities. The brain is deeper than the sea. So we know that's possible. It's rhetorically possible to contain the sea in your mind. And impossible, of course, both are true. But the brain is just the weight of God. That's where it moves from the realm of being sort of playful, metaphorically, sky and sea, which you can see, to something you can't see. And then she imagines actually hefting. And it's the word heft, that she, sometimes in her poems you can see she tried out lots of other words in the margins. And scholars now are printing her poems with those tryouts there, so you could see how she made her choices. Heft them. That's such a tactile word. You're hefting the weight of God and your brain, which is, again, sort of comical. I think of this expression, watch your eyes. Like if you're going through the woods and there might be a stick that would poke. It's really funny that watch your eyes. You can't watch your eyes. You can't heft your brain. But in a way you can. You can mentally. And then this amazing ending, and they will differ, if they do, as syllable from sound. Which seems to me not at all. What is the syllable without the sound? Well, a syllable could be on a page with no sound. But all these possibilities she's keeping in mind. So I think of her as an example of a very old soul who's also very childlike. And now she has more readers than she's ever had because there are more people receptive to this idea that she was a kind of Shakespearean character, but working on a very small scale. So I'm just going to read it again. The brain is wider than the sky, for put them side by side, the one the other will contain, with ease and you beside. The brain is deeper than the sea, for hold them blue to blue, the one the other will absorb, as sponges, buckets do. The brain is just the weight of God, for heft them, pound for pound, and they will differ, if they do, as syllable from sound. So let's read the new version of the Lord's Prayer, which you'll find on your lilac-colored card. Let's read this together. Creator, Redeemer, Sustainer, Way, Truth, and Life, force of love and light, flowing within and all around us, may your realm of compassion, justice, and peace rule our world. Thank you for nurturing and guiding us, forgiving us and helping us forgive, and leading us away from harmful desires. Please save us from all forms of evil, for you are our source, our home, our power, all goodness and beauty forever.
Okay, 15, Luke, verses 2 to 7. And the Pharisees and the tribes were grumbling and saying, "This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them." So he told them this parable. Which one of you, having 100 sheep, and losing one of them, does not leave the 99 in the wilderness and goes after the one that is lost until he finds it? And when he has found it, he lays it on his shoulders and he rejoices. And when he comes home, he calls together his friends and neighbors, saying to them, "Rejoice with me, for I have found the sheep that was lost." Just so I tell you, there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who need no repentance. And the next reading is John chapter 4, verses 4 to 20, I believe. Yes, 4 through 20. But he had to go through Samaria. So he came to a Samaritan city called Sychar, where the plot of ground that Jacob had given to his son Joseph was. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired out by his journey, was sitting by the well. It was about noon. A Samaritan woman came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." His disciples had gone to the city to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask a drink of me, a woman of Samaria?" Jews do not share things in common with Samaritans. Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that is saying to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." The woman said to him, "Sir, you have no bucket, and the well is deep. Where do you get that living water? Are you greater than our ancestor Jacob, who gave us the well, and with his son and his flocks drank from it?" Jesus said to her, "Everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again, but those who drink of the water that I will give them will never be thirsty. The water that I will give becomes in them a spring of water gushing up to eternal life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water so that I may never be thirsty or have to keep coming here to draw water." Jesus said to her, "Go, call your husband and come back." The woman answered him, "I have no husband." Jesus said to her, "You are right in saying, 'I have no husband,' for you have had 5 husbands, and the one you have now is not your husband. What you have said is true." The woman said to him, "Sir, I see that you are a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you say that the place where people must worship is in Jerusalem." Here ends the reading.
Well, on Friday, when we learned that Rachel wouldn't be able to come, Becky said, "Will you read something?" And, oh, you need, oh, yes. Thank you. I've been thinking lately about a book written by a Vermonter, Garrett Kaiser. He's known as a high school teacher. He's written 2 books about teaching high school in the Northeast Kingdom. And he's also a kind of journalist philosopher, if such a thing is possible. And he has written a book about noise, just the clamor of noise around us all the time. He's written a book about privacy. And I've been reading this book called The Enigma of Anger, being very, very aware, as we all are, that we're living in a really angry time. If we're not angry ourselves, we're seeing people around us who seem to be angry all the time or suddenly angry. So I'm going to read a part of an essay here. This whole book is very worthwhile, and I think I'll leave it in the library when I've finished it. But this is about anger as fear, and you'll see he explains why this formulation comes to his mind. And then I'm going to omit some pieces of it just for clarity and brevity, but I think this will stand as it is. There's a little epigraph at the beginning of the chapter, "Love casts out fear," from John. Oh, and I should also mention, in addition to a high school teacher, Garrett Kaiser is an Episcopal minister in a little church in Sutton, Vermont. Once during a discussion at my church, a man remarked that anger is nothing but fear. He claimed to speak from experience. I was immediately skeptical, in part because I'm always skeptical of any statement phrased in the reductive terms of "nothing but," in part because I could not believe that a man of his formidable size and commanding personality had found much to fear in his life, an assumption that was far more reductive than his statement. And in large part because I resisted the humbling connection between my own robust capacities for anger and anything as paltry as fear. Was my friend suggesting that anger was nothing but an indication of cowardice? Of course, if we locate the source of anger in our primordial flight or fight response, there's nothing especially shocking or profound in what this man had to say. It's a simple thing to prove, and on any number of occasions I have discovered that I was indeed angry because I was also afraid. I have noticed my rage rushing to encase and contain my fear like the antibody of some emotional immune system. And this is basically a good thing, because while fear paralyzes you, anger prepares you to act. In some cases, though, acting on anger can be more dangerous than not acting because of fear. Anger is constructive only to the extent that fear is reasonable. But knowing as much is not very helpful once you're angry. Trying to eliminate anger can be every bit as futile as trying to eliminate any other emotion, as trying to be happy when you're deeply depressed, for instance, or to get over it when you've been shamefully humiliated. You feel what you feel. So often the attempt to rise above anger can amount to a vain exercise in fakery, like sitting on a bed of nails and pretending that it doesn't hurt, which gives way in a howling cry of pain once the ruse becomes unbearable. This is where the recognition of a link between anger and fear becomes useful, something much better than one of those barstool equations to which we respond, I see what you mean. Though what we don't see is how the equation has any practical relevance whatsoever. Sometimes I have found that the best way to overcome my anger is to deal with it indirectly by overcoming my fear. It may sound as though I'm doing nothing more than giving my anger a different name, but fear can be opposed by a simple act of will in a way that anger cannot. So then he gives an example. Once I was prevented from pulling into a supermarket parking lot by a pickup truck idling just inside the entrance. The driver and his 2 passengers were chatting with someone who'd just come out of the market. And though I suspected that the driver was aware of my presence in his rearview mirror, he was in no hurry to be on his way. So there I sat, pulled up as close behind him as I could get, with my own behind sticking out in the busy main street. I did not honk my horn, which probably would have been the most reasonable thing to do. I have certain scruples about car horns. I use them liberally as a warning, but I generally refuse to use them as a prod, as at a red light that has just turned green, or a threat. In this case, I might not have used that horn because I preferred being ignored with at least a pretense that it was not deliberate to being ignored outright. I also preferred to avoid an escalation. Would I get out of my car if the horn didn't do the trick? And would I get out of my car if these 3 scruffy fellows decided to get out of theirs first? In a situation like this, my mind tends to overload with considerations. One of the foremost for me is always time. These guys were wasting mine, but a confrontation was likely to waste still more. I also remembered that I was supposed to be living the gospel. Shouldn't one be prepared to bear these innocuous injuries with patience? On the other hand, are you truly loving your neighbor as yourself if, through a cowardly tolerance of someone's boorish behavior, you set a precedent for your neighbor to be similarly abused? How often don't patience, mercy, tolerance, all the so-called liberal virtues, come down to drinking a toast to your own benevolence and leaving it to someone else to pay for the drink? Well, of course, by the time you've listened to even a few of these voices, the truck has moved, and you're ready to go grocery shopping. Except by that time, you're so angry, you could spit, and what is more, deeply ashamed to recognize that in the end, you were not rational or charitable so much as you were simply afraid. Anger may arise from fear. It may also arise from recognizing the fear and loathing it. Somewhere in the supermarket, in the midst of deciding which box of crackers to buy and which kind of apple, I decided that I hated the way I felt and that I wanted to feel different, no matter the cost. And so, when I came out of my car with my groceries, instead of driving directly home, I began to search for the truck, which was identifiable by a faded sign painted on one of its doors. I wasn't sure what I was going to do if I found it, but I was going to try to find it. Although this was a Saturday morning, and although searching for a particular pickup truck in my region is a little like searching for a particular alligator in the Everglades, I did happen to sight the truck parked outside a Down at the Heels mechanic shop. The garage door was down and the windows covered, so I wasn't sure at first the shop was even open, but when I went inside, I found 3 men under the hood of a car. I asked them if they were connected to the truck parked in front of the garage. When they said they were, I recounted what had happened at the supermarket and the fact that I didn't appreciate being treated as they had treated me. What happened next is barely remarkable, though what might have happened next, if, for instance, one of the men had decided to deck me with a lug wrench, might have been terribly remarkable. But what interests me here is what I felt at that moment, a total absence of anger, and, if not a total absence of fear, then a mastery of it so complete that I might almost have been disappointed were the fear to have vanished. I felt calm. More important, I felt alive. All of the men were looking at me now. None of them seemed sure what to make of me. Later, I would recognize their response as a main advantage to calming anger by facing fear. One's adversaries are momentarily thrown off guard. It is much easier to classify and therefore respond to an angry person than to one who is, well, acting with all the chutzpah of an angry person but with none of the anger. After a moment, one of the men said, "That wasn't us." Of course it was, but I saw no reason to argue the point. The man's lie may have been his attempt to save face, but it was no less a concession than if he'd been forced to cry, "I'm sorry," on his knees. Indeed, it was more so because no one was forcing him to do anything. Our business was finished. I had told a simple truth without bluster or accusation, and he had defended himself with a flimsy lie. I left the shop feeling better than many a cathartic explosion of rage has made me feel. What is more, I didn't have to spend any extra emotional capital on feeling sorry for my adversary or retroactively foolish on my own behalf, as I might have felt had I gotten mad at him. Of course, an episode like this doesn't amount to an epiphany I might like to make of it. The same problem handled in the same way might end in disaster. The same problem handled in the same way might lead me back to the very same dilemma that created the problem in the first place, except that I would lack the advantage of sorting the problem out within the protective enclosure of my car. Still, the episode was not without some value for me. For one thing, I feel I can better understand the phenomenal equanimity of certain persons who have carried on campaigns of nonviolent resistance. Perhaps they did not so much overcome their own anger through nonviolence as they used nonviolence to face and overcome their fears. Given that victory, their anger was almost moot. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. If anger is sometimes nothing but fear, then what do we fear that has such power over our emotions? One of the things we fear most is losing a battle. It is as if the primal emotion of anger arises in us because every conflict in some way recalls some primal conflict when our very lives were at stake. Though the conflict at present may in fact be no more primal than an argument over the minutiae of office procedure or the up or down position of a toilet seat. Remember that we had been talking about anger in the head, anger that arises from a dread of losing, when the consequence of losing are a good deal less than dreadful, is obviously the result of mental distortion. We've all had the experience of playing a recreational game with someone, or even as someone, who could not stand the idea of losing, whose keenness for winning spoiled the fun, who was a jerk, in other words. But in the day-to-day business of our lives, many of us play in the same way, so that a keenness to win becomes an irresistible rage to win. Admittedly, we sometimes fear losing because we see some higher principle at stake in the conflict. It is that principle, we insist, and not our own pride, that motivates our passion. This may be true, and I have little sympathy and recommend giving no quarter to those who try to ignore principles or belittle conflicts because, as they're fond of saying, this is not a matter of life and death. Not a matter of death, perhaps, but almost always a matter of life. If principles have nothing to do with the quotidian details of office equipment and toilet seats, if they only have to do with the vast and vague and grand scale, then they're worthless. The same goes for the hackneyed evasion much beloved by traveling bigamists, serial killers, and the winners of contested presidential elections. It's time to move forward. As soon as you hear someone use those words, you know that of all things possible at that moment, moving forward is not on the list. Any housekeeper can tell you that. People who move forward from their messes, rather than cleaning them up, only go on to make other messes, usually bigger ones. So, it is not a delusion to insist on the principle of the thing in a given conflict. The delusion comes from fearfully assuming that the principle is defeated just because that the principle is defeated just because we are. The truth loses out because a liar wins, or that justice no longer exists because we fail in our attempt to challenge some injustice. The partisans who fought in the resistance during the last World War seem to have possessed a confidence that went beyond the fear of any such outcome. Certainly they were afraid, and should have been afraid, of the kind of world that would result if Hitler prevailed. But could they have believed that all decency would die if they lost? I don't think so. If decency were so terminal, they had lost already. It is also a delusion to believe that in losing some conflict, we ourselves are diminished, even in our very being. We believe so when we have thoroughly identified ourselves with the issue at stake. If I lose, I am a loser. But defeat in itself is no diminishment, which may be one reason why conquerors have routinely followed their victories with atrocities. If possible, the subjugation that victory alone can never accomplish. The vanquished are not less for being defeated. Indeed, they sometimes grow stronger in defeat, just as a cause sometimes gains permanence through being lost. I try to remind myself of that now and again. I'm suspicious of self-hypnotic formulas, self-help mantras, and all the rest, but I'm also suspicious of letting my suspicions deprive me of good comfort when it's available. So I've composed a simple motto that has sometimes proved useful for me. You do not have to win. You only have to fight. And you have to remember that any cause worth fighting for is larger than you. Another way of saying that is, you do not have to be afraid. And another way still is, you do not have to be angry. So I'm going to read one other place where he is using a specific example. I realize this is a little bit hard listening. He's in gnarly thinking. So his daughter is a high school student in this episode, and she's been practicing extremely hard on the clarinet for a school concert. From the time when her instrument was almost as tall as she, I had watched her struggle with it. Her eyes, those of an overloaded pony, as she strained with all her might to make the notes. That night she would be the only first clarinet on a difficult song. She dressed early in her holiday clothes, new evergreen dress, candy cane-colored sweater, snowman earrings. She was almost as nervous as she was beautiful. Her mother and I told her she'd do fine. I was going to the concert for her, of course, but it was not as if my only pleasure came from her. How many things on earth are as lovely as a children's chorus, to name but one of the night's attractions, especially when the choristers not only desire to sing, but dare to sing. especially when their young teacher is even more nervous and almost as endearing as they are, especially when they perform in a place where life can be so hard and the winter so bleak that any single thing of beauty is a grace so amazing it hurts. All I wanted to do was sit for an hour and enjoy these kids and this music in peace. I wanted to hear the words that they had struggled to memorize. I wanted to follow the notes that they had struggled to produce. An artistic performance is like a Thanksgiving meal, be it grandma's or the Holy Eucharist. Someone has gone to a lot of trouble on your behalf, and all you're required to do is sit down and eat, watch, or listen. And in the right frame of mind, that is all you want to do. Be nourished and be grateful. As an aside, I would note this frame of mind is worth the attention of any careful student of anger. Learn to recognize the mood and moment when all I want is such a little thing. That is, when you have reduced your negotiation with the world to one modest requirement that ought to be yours by virtue of its being so modest. This is often a prelude to anger. First of all, because you're already drawing a line in the sand by demanding that one small thing, and second, because even that one small thing can turn out to be more than you're going to get. It would be more than I got that night. Behind me, as there must always be behind me, two women were chattering away. One leaned forward now and then to talk to her husband or boyfriend, who for some reason was sitting beside me instead of her, and who in his antsy distraction made a St. Vitus dance look like a tree sloth on a particularly logy day. The other woman, when she wasn't blabbing to her friend, was telling her little boy to keep quiet, to sit still, to behave. Except for the patter of his feet when he ran away from her, I could hardly hear him. Mainly, I heard her. This was her performance too, you see. I've been an audience to 100 others just like it. The performance of ostentatious parental control by a person with absolutely no parental control and not a clue how to achieve it. Within the space of two songs, a 16th century carol and an Appalachian folk ballad, the last stanza of which was drowned out by her nagging, she had exhausted her entire repertoire, threatening to make the child sit out the concert in the car, in the cold parked car, or else on her lap like a baby. Finally, she seemed to wear him down. At last, she had the opportunity of setting him a good example of how you behave in a concert, by carrying on with her friend like a couple of Klondike barmaids. During the intermission, a good-natured neighbor of mine shook her head and whispered, "Well, it takes all kinds, I guess," which was the last straw for me. Rudeness under the auspices of diversity. I suppose that all kinds might even include the Ku Klux Klan. Of course, my neighbor was only trying to commiserate, to be reasonable, except that reason and reasonable solutions were all meaningless here. Someone might say to me, "Why didn't you turn around and simply ask the woman to be quiet?" This is reason? To suppose that a person who would not attend to her own child making music would nevertheless listen to a perfect stranger making a fuss? "Well, you should have moved then," another reasonable voice says. "Change your seat. For that matter, maybe you should change your address." Yes, maybe I should have annoyed a dozen other people by crawling over them on the rare chance of finding a seat where I wouldn't be annoyed. And yes, maybe I should move away to some genteel place where instead of showing off their poor parental skills, the backseat blabbermouths show off their superior knowledge of Renaissance vocal music. Only a hick believes that urbanity exists in a more urban place. Nothing reasonable could have worked here, and to reason with my anger was as pointless as reasoning with the two women. So what could I do? Suffer. I said the word to myself as an imperative sentence, suffer. That is what I could do, maybe all I could do. I could suffer. And that is surely what the mother who sat behind me does, whatever else she does or doesn't do. And I bet, and I could hear it in her voice, that she does a lot more than I do. She suffers. Finally, I could remember that above all, and in spite of all that we suffer, at least at that moment, our children were singing. A man's daughter was going to play her clarinet, and I could applaud. So let's just take a moment to think and settle and quiet. going back into the busy world in a little while, but call this room the sanctuary, and that's how it feels. So let's sing together. This is 723 in the bright red hymnal, Shall We Gather at the River?
Shall we gather at the river, where bright angel leaves draw, with its crystal tide forever, flowing by the throne of God? Yes, we'll gather at the river, the beautiful river. Gather with the saints at the river that flows by the throne of God. On the margin of the river, washing up its silver spray, we will walk and worship ever on a happy golden day. Yes, we'll gather at the river, the beautiful river. Gather with the saints at the river that flows by the throne of God. Where we reach the shining river, lay we every burden down. Grace our spirits will deliver and provide our broken ground. Yes, we'll gather at the river, the beautiful river. Gather with the saints at the river that flows by the throne of God. Soon we'll reach the shining river. Soon our pilgrimage will cease. Soon our happy hearts will quiver with the melody of peace. Yes, we'll gather at the river, the beautiful river. Gather with the saints at the river that flows by the throne of God.
As a benediction, I'm going to read a poem from William Strafford. He was a conscientious objector during World War II, which was not an easy route to choose, and was incarcerated for that. But he was a person like few are, really, like Thich Nhat Hanh or like the Dalai Lama, who was able to live devoted to this principle of decency to everyone he encountered. And he's imagining a monument, not to the unknown soldier, but to the unknown enemy. For the unknown enemy. This monument is for the unknown good in our enemies. Like a picture, their life began to appear. They gathered at home in the evening and sang. Above their fields they saw a new sky. A holiday came, and they carried the baby to the park for a party. Sunlight surrounded them. Here we glimpse what our minds long turned away from. The great mutual blindness darkened that sunlight in the park, and the sky that was new, and the holidays. This monument says that one afternoon we stood here, letting a part of our minds escape. They came back, but different. Enemy, one day we glimpsed your life. This monument is for you.